Hello and welcome to my best of 3 sideboard guide for Mono-Red Aggro. I hope you all have been enjoying the Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and this is going to be a little bit behind because I'm preparing this before Outlaws came out. So we're going to see changes to this, but there's still going to be useful information for just the general strategy and matchup analysis that I like to do every Friday. So this is a list by Mogged, who took down the Standard Challenge 64, and they are a fantastic mono-red player. And we saw them taking a kind of a different approach here. So we've got a lot of the classics, though, like Kumano, the 4 Monastery Swift Spears, 2 Monstrous Rage, 4 Play with Fires, 3 Bloodthirsty Adversaries, 3 Charming Scoundrels. The Fugitive Codebreaker is the one that I haven't seen. I've seen it more in prowess decks in like Gruul. And so bringing this into the mono red, it's not, game changing. They're not the only ones to do it. Kind of gives you like a second copy of Monastery Swift Spear. But we got 4 copies of Lightning Strike, 2 copies of Squee, 3 copies of Godric, 4 copies of Witchstalker Frenzy, which a lot of lists will be running a little bit less than 4 of this, so that was kind of interesting to see. And then 1 copy of Thundering Raiju, 3 copies of Mishra's Foundry, 1 Sokenzan's, 19 Mountains. And then as far as the sideboard goes, we've got 2 In the Festivities, 3 Lithomanic Barrage, 2 Koth Fire of Resistance, 3 Cemetery Gatekeepers, which I thought was that one's one that I hadn't seen before, 2 Obliterating Bolts, and 3 Urbresk's Forge. So we're going to go in depth on what cards are best in which matchups based off of tracker data, and I'll see you on the other side. All right, so every week the reason why I do this is because I was upset with the sideboard guides that I was finding on Google, and most of them were behind paywalls or they had conflicting information. And so I decided to look into tracker data and see if we could find some less biased sources. So what I do is I look up the specific list that we just covered by Mogged and look up its win rate versus a specific archetype, and then I choose the archetypes. I covered the top 8 or so of the most common tournament decks in the best of 3 scene, according to MTG Goldfish, which is a website that tracks tournament data. So here we can see top of the list here, the 4 copies of Witchstalker Frenzy against Demir's aggression. Makes sense that having the interaction, their threats, is helpful. And then on down the line, and the worst cards in our deck are probably the Fugitive Codebreakers in this matchup. Black in general, cut down makes the Fugitive Codebreaker a little bit worse, especially because of... You can use Monstrous Rage to cancel it, but if you're using like a Shock, it's going to become a 3/2 and it still dies to cut down. We do see that In the Festivities is a sideboard option that we could bring in. It's at least better than the Codebreakers. And then we could also bring in Urbresk's Forge, which is also better than the Codebreakers. And then the other thing that I like to do is I like to look at alternative lists. So this way I can kind of see what might have been missing in the mono-red list. And top of the list here, we've got Nahiri's Warcrafting. And if you followed me for any period of time, then you know that I have I have a special place in my heart for Nahiri's Warcrafting. And I tend to like it more than the Witchstalker Frenzy. And in this matchup, it would be better to be running the Nahiri's Warcrafting than the Witchstalker Frenzy. We do also see a couple other missing options like Invasion of Tarkir, Blazing Crescendo, Ren's Resolve, and to a lesser extent, Shock, Shivan Devastator, and Voldaren Epicure. As far as all archetypes go, so what I can do is I can change it between, on the tracker website, I can change it to all archetypes that are running the card instead of just specifically mono-red aggro. And what this is nice for is sometimes like sideboard options will pop out that don't have a lot of data. You do have to take this with a grain of salt, though, because it is for all archetypes, and so the card might be performing better in a specific archetype rather than in mono-red. But still useful to look at sometimes, and not for this one. So I think the data is suggesting that we should bring in the 2 copies of In the Festivities from the sideboard, and 1 copy of Urbresk's Forge, and cut the 3 Fugitive Codebreakers. And In the Festivities hits Spyglass Siren, Deep Cavern Bat, and Fairy Mastermind, so it makes sense to bring in as a sideboard option. And then Urbresk's Forge can also be difficult for them to deal with. but their pace is usually very quick, very fast, very aggressive. So it may not be worth bringing in all 3 copies anyway, compared to some other matchups. And then, as I mentioned, Fugitive Codebreaker is weak to cut down, and you can save it with Monstrous Rage, which is a fun little trick to do and can kind of, blow them out. But it also dies to go for the throat if they don't have the cut down. Then we've got Esper Midrange, which is the second most common matchup at the time of doing this. And we can see from this list that we should be bringing in the 3 copies of Urbrask's Forge. And as far as the weakest cards, we should probably cut the 1 copy of Thundering Raiju and the 2 copies of Bloodthirsty Adversary. As far as alternative strategies go, we do have a couple of missing options, such as the case of the Crimson Pulse, Nahiri's Warcrafting, Shock, Rin's Resolve, Invasion of Regatha, Invasion of Tarkir, and Chandra Dressed to Kill. And then all archetypes, again, this one is, take it with a grain of salt. Thundering Raiju is at the top of the list here, and earlier on it was on the bottom of the list for Mono-Red. So I tend to trust the Mono-Red specific data over all archetypes. So this is a good example of what I was talking about. The other thing that's also noticeable is that Lithomanic Barrage is missing, which is a pretty common thing to bring in against the blue-white creatures of Esper midrange. So as I think the data suggests that we bring in the 3 copies of Urbrask's Forge, cut the 1 Thundering Raiju, and the 2 Bloodthirsty Adversaries. And Urbrask's Forge, Esper midrange can definitely struggle with artifacts, and they are a much slower matchup than the Demir midrange. So Urbrask's Forge has an opportunity to overrun them in the late game. And then Thundering Raiju is ripe for Counterspell at 4 mana. It's kind of difficult to get down on the board. And then if it does get down on the board, it does just die to go for the throat. So, and then Bloodthirsty Adversary lines up poorly against the Dinnic Pious Apprentice, and is a pretty common inclusion in the Esper midrange lists. Next up, we've got Boros Convoke, and for this matchup, we should bring in the Festivities, as well as the Obliterating Bolt. And then bottom of the list here, Thundering Raiju again, and then 3 copies of Bloodthirsty Adversary. As alternative strategies, we've got a fair amount, but some of these are coming in from the Gruul aggro list. Can kind of get confused in the tracker as Mono-Red data, because the only green card in some lists for Gruul is Questing Druid, and then the rest of them are red. So if they don't play their Questing Druid, the tracker might think that it's just a Mono-Red list. But anyway, so we see things like Sticky Fingers, Ancestral Anger, Frantic Scapegoat, Festival Crasher, Twisted Fealty, Voldaren Epicure, Kinra's Spellspear, Mirren Banesplitter. So a lot of these are from the Gruul aggro combat tricks deck outside of Twisted Fealty and Voldaren Epicure. And then as far as all archetypes go, nothing pops out. And that kind of makes sense. Mono-Red is kind of doing its own thing. There's not a lot of crossover where other decks are also running those cards, except for the Gruul combat tricks list. Boros Convoke, I think the data suggests that we bring in the 2 copies of In the Festivities, 2 Obliterating Bolts, cut the Thundering Raiju, cut the 3 copies of Bloodthirsty Adversary, and the reason why I underlined the Twisted Fealty and the Voldaren Epicure were there was to denote that those were the ones that were common Mono-Red alternatives as opposed to crossover from the Gruul combat tricks. And then we've got, and Frantic Scapegoat maybe is an exception. In the Festivities, Cole's the swarm of 1/1s that come off of like Voldaren Epicure, Gleeful Demolition, and the Resolute Reinforcements, and is a common sideboard option for red decks against Boros Convoke. Whereas Obliterating Bolt lines up nicely against Knight Errant of Eos and is in exile. It exiles the creature, which is useful for the Sanguine Evangelist so that it doesn't leave behind the 1/1 bat. Thundering Raiju is and Bloodthirsty both are better later in the game, so on turn 4 and turn 5, at least in theory. And then the problem with Boros Convoke is that the game has usually been decided by that point. And they're usually overrunning you and hitting into their Imidane's Recruiter. So the top end of the curve doesn't line up particularly well against Boros Convoke. Next up, we've got Temur Control, and nothing really stands out here as far as sideboard options. other than like it's a favorable matchup against their only hope is to hit an ill-timed explosion, and even then it's not necessarily the end of the game, right? But the weakest cards in the list are Thundering Raiju, and then Witchstalker Frenzy does not have a whole lot of great options to hit in Temur control. As far as alternative lists go, we do see some missing options here. So we see NT Cynical of the Sun, Pyrotechnic Performer. Again, that one might be crossing over from the Cruel Combat Tricks deck. Rin's Resolve, Nahiri's Warcrafting, Case of the Crimson Pulse, and then Ancestral Anger, which is definitely coming from that Gruul deck. As far as all archetypes go, again, no crossover. And so for Temur control, we've got a really easy one, which is no sideboard. And you could... So with an asterisk, right? You could cut 1 Thundering Raiju and 2 Witchstalker Frenzy and bring in the 3 Cemetery Gatekeepers. But the data doesn't actually show that, since it is a new tech that Mogged was bringing to the tournament scene. So I expect over time that one does make sense, because Cemetery Gatekeeper pings them for 2 every time that they play a land, and that deck is playing landfalls. They're doing 2 lands a turn. So you're looking at 4 damage every time that they're looping into their lands. So seems like a pretty strong counter to me. The matchup is favored quite heavily, and perhaps the sideboard should be spent to bring in text against some of the harder matchups. But it kind of depends on how much you're expecting to come up against Temur control, right? Because being able to destroy them just out of the water is a free win in a tournament scene, right? Next up, we have Domain, and we should definitely be bringing in the Urabrask's Forge. And then worst card in the list here outside of the sideboard is the Fugitive Codebreaker. And then for alternative strategies, we're missing Shivan Devastator and Felden Ronim Excavator. And then all archetypes, again, we see contradicting data, where Codebreaker is at the top of the list. So if there is contradicting data, what you can do is maybe feel more comfortable subbing out the second card. So since like Codebreaker was the worst, but maybe instead of taking out the Codebreakers, we bring out the Witchstalker's Frenzy, because Domain doesn't have a whole lot of great targets for the Witchstalker Frenzy. And then so for the data, I think suggests bringing in the 3 copies of the Urabrask's Forge and cutting the 3 copies of the Fugitive Codebreaker. Urabrask's Forge is pretty hard for Domain to deal with. The really only answer they have is Leyline Binding, because they can exile any non-land permanent. And so they can kind of struggle with the artifacts. And Urabrask's Forge also survives all of the board wipes of like Temporary Lockdown, Depopulate, Sunfall. So it can be a sticky threat that is hard for Domain to deal with. Whereas Fugitive Codebreaker, again, there was contradicting data. But for me, the big problem with this is that it trades with 1/1s off of Courier's Briefcase if you can't trigger Prowess. And not every list in Domain is running Courier's Briefcase, but against Mono-Red and against Demir aggro, it is something that some of the lists are sideboarding in best of 3. So personally, I'd rather my 2-drops have 2 toughness for this matchup specifically, but I could see taking out the Witchstalker's Frenzy instead, since they are not likely to have a good target until turn 3 or turn 4 with the Topiary Stomper. And then as far as the mirror match goes, we can see here nothing is coming out specifically from the sideboard, and nothing really should be brought in from the sideboard. As far as alternative strategies go, we are missing Atali's Favor, NT Cynical of the Sun, Tommy's Flare, Dreadmaw's Ire, Furnace Reigns, Imidane's Recruiter, Invasion of Tarkir, Harried Spearguard, and Pyrotechnic Performer. As far as all strategies go, nothing popping out. So again, this one's a pretty easy one for Mono-Red Aggro. I don't think that it was a very common matchup expected in the standard challenge. Mogged was probably one of the fewer lists that was happening in that tournament. So I don't think that it was set up to really care about the Mono-Red Aggro matchup, and so no sideboard is needed. There is a fair amount of missing options in this list, but none of them are particularly common, and you don't see a whole lot of crossover between missing options in other lists. maybe except for like outside of NT. But the reason why I put them there is so to give you some alternative strategies. If you're currently playing and you feel like you keep losing to other mono red decks, you could kind of look for alternative options. So Azorius Control is the next one, and with an asterisk, Demir Control was actually more popular than Azorius Control, but Demir Control is still missing in the data on the tracker, and it is a relatively new archetype for best of 3, and usually you see even less of a desire to play Control in best of 1 because of the hand smoother. So there's very, very little data on the Mirror Control. But Azorius Control has fallen off in popularity. It's number 9. It's still something that you may bump into. But I'll cover it instead because it does have some crossover. Since they're both control strategies, there should be some crossover in what is being planned to be brought in. And we see at the top of the list here, against control, just like domain, we should be bringing in Urabrask's Forge. And then bring in 2 copies of In the Festivities, and cut the 3 copies of Fugitive Codebreaker and 2 copies of the Witchtalker Frenzy. Alternative strategies, we're missing Chandra Dressed to Kill. The Planeswalker is a little bit more harder for Azorius Control to deal with because it doesn't get hit by the board wipes. Mechanized Warfare is kind of a throwback at this point. There was a mono-red burn deck that's actually better off against control than the aggro version, because if you can get the Mechanized Warfare down, you eventually just get enough damage through despite their counterspells and their interaction. Shivan Devastator and Feldon Ronom Excavator also making it on this list. And then all strategies, again, kind of a whiff. And then, so I think the data suggests we bring in the 3 copies of Urabrask's Forge, the 2 copies of In the Festivities, cut the 3 copies of Fugitive Codebreaker, and cut the 2 copies of Witchtalker Frenzy. Urabrask's Forge gets around the board wipes, and In the Festivities is one that I think a lot of people will miss this. Similar to like bringing in Cut Down or like some of the interaction. Typically you think, oh, well, there's no creatures or there's very few creatures in Azorius Control, so I'm going to take out the stuff that's good against creatures. But In the Festivities does get rid of the 1/1s from Sunset Revelry, and like Kumano, also pops Planeswalkers for 1 damage, which lines up particularly nice against the Wandering Emperor. Sometimes it's sitting there just at 1 loyalty in, being able to hit it and get rid of it. Fugitive Codebreaker, the 1 toughness, once again, gets you in trouble if you can't trigger the prowess against 1/1s off of like the Sunset Revelry. And if you're completely sold on keeping Codebreaker, you could take out more copies of Witchtalker Frenzy, which has very few targets that it can hit because it can't target Planeswalkers. I do suggest cutting 2, since you can still hit something like a 2/2 off of Wandering Emperor, or you can use it to remove a Restless Land like the Restless Anchorage, the man land in it. Then we've got Golgari Midrange, and this is another one where we should be bringing in the Urabrask's Forge. Definitely a good sideboard option to have. And then Thundering Raiju is at the bottom of the list, and so is Fugitive Codebreaker. And then missing options here, we've got Nahiri's Warcrafting, again at the top of the list. Twisted Fealty, Kenra's Spellspear, Shivan Devastator, Invasion of Regatha, Rin's Resolve, in case of the Crimson Pulse. Again, all archetypes not particularly useful this time around, but I do it every single time anyway, so it's better for other archetypes. Golgari Midrange, what I think the data is suggesting is that we bring in the 3 copies of Urabrask's Forge, cut the Thundering Raiju, and 2 copies of the Fugitive Codebreaker. Urabrask's Forge, again, Golgari Midrange can struggle to destroy artifacts. Like the artifacts can't be destroyed by like Cut Down and Go for the Throat. Some Golgari lists will be running Tranquil Frillback or Tear Asunder, but it gets around the more common removal. And then Thundering Raiju, on the other hand, does not. It gets destroyed by the removal running in that Golgari Midrange is running. And Fugitive Codebreaker works better when they can't block through your Monstrous Rage combo. So Glissa, Sunslayer, specifically has First Strike and Death Touch, which does not care what your toughness is. And not to mention, Golgari Midrange is also running the cut downs that they can play in response to you playing a spell with Prowess. So my overall sideboard impressions for going through this, it's always nice to see how a master like Mogged decided to approach the archetype, and to me, it's no surprise that this list is highly optimized and pretty ready to go, bringing innovative solutions like Cemetery Gatekeeper. And most of my comments are going to be personal preference or for ladder climbing instead of the tournament scene, because Mogged was clearly anticipating specific matchups in that, and that's why you can see like bringing in the Fugitive Codebreaker was particularly good against, like, if you're going to be up against Esper midrange. There are 3 sideboard options that didn't show up. There's always going to be some stuff that doesn't show up in the data that are commonly used in best of 3 as sideboard options that don't get used very often. So the amount of games that the tracker has a chance to grab is relatively low. And so we see Cemetery Gatekeeper, Lithomanic Barrage, and Koth Fire of Resistance all have no data. As far as the culprits that were at the bottom of the list, we had Fugitive Codebreaker and Thundering Raiju. So you may want to substitute them outside of the tournament scene, because Esper midrange is a very common deck in the tournament scene. It's less common on the ladder in best of 3. So if you're going to go for climbing the ladder in Arena, I do think that you might want to tweak this list a little bit. And then again, I have a little bit of a bias towards Nahiri's Warcrafting, and I'm still torn on whether or not we should be running Nahiri's Warcrafting or Witchstalker Frenzy. And it was nice to actually look at the data and see what the data was saying as far as like which one's better against which matchups. And so if you're considering it in best of 1, you can kind of see where it's good and where it's bad, right? So the more that you're coming up against these mid-range and control strategies, then the card draw off of Nahiri's Warcrafting is more important, whereas the faster strategies favor the Witchstalker Frenzy because it's cheaper. So they both have their pros and cons. And so like Nahiri's Warcrafting would be better against the Demir midrange, Esper midrange, Temur Control, and Golgari midrange. So it definitely hits a spread of the meta, and I think personally I would explore it as a sideboard option where you could kind of bring it in for a specific matchup, because it was the top of the alternative list in several of the matchups. I also might consider adding a copy of the Shivan Devastator to the main. It seems to perform better than the Thundering Raiju, and so it could be an interesting sideboard option, or just a straight up replacement. Could help. So thanks for listening to my best of 3 sideboard guide for Mono-Red Aggro. I'm very excited to see how Outlaws of Thunder Junction shakes up the meta. Yeah, on Monday I did my speculation and my brewing, so it's always the new set is always fun time to explore and see how new archetypes pop up and stuff, right? So as always, let me know what has been working for you and what you think. Sideboards always make interesting discussions, and this is a weekly series, so if you'd like more content like this in the future, remember to click like and subscribe, and I'll probably choose the first archetype based off of the data that's available and what we're seeing in kind of like week 1, week 2, and so there won't be a poll for the next archetype for the best of 3 sideboard guides. So when you don't see it, don't panic. It will be there eventually. And after we get into Outlaws of Thunder Junction and kind of get a little bit better idea about what's going on. So once again, special thanks to my YouTube members. You keep me going. This is a dream of mine to be able to do this full time, and it's through your help that this is going to be a possibility. So thank you all for the support. And if you aren't a YouTube member, I get it. Money's tight, and just being a part of my community means so much to me. So good luck crushing your matches or RCQs, and maybe I'll see you on the ladder.